What gives rise to magnetism?
The type of magnetism you're most familiar with. The kind that keeps magnets on your fridge is technically known as ferromagnetism. Ferromagnets are permanent magnets. They generate their own magnetic field. Ferromagnets have unpaired electrons, so from the information in the previous question we can say that ferromagnets are paramagnetic, not diamagnetic. But ferromagnets have one additional key trait: the unpaired electron spins are all aligned in the same direction, which generates a permanent magnetic field. Let's go through this again from the beginning. Electrons have spin, a quantum mechanical property. But we don't need to go that far back, and this spin generates a very, very tiny magnetic field. If all the electrons in a substance are paired, it is diamagnetic. If there are unpaired electrons, the substance is paramagnetic. If there are unpaired electrons and those unpaired electrons are aligned so that there is a net spin for the macroscopic substance, it is a ferromagnetic. Ferromagnets are the magnets, you know, they stick to your fridge.
Why did Robert F. Curl Jr., United States, Sir Harold W. Crotto, United Kingdom, and Richard E. Smalley, United States, win the Nobel Prize for Chemistry?
For their discovery of fullerenes. This Nobel Prize was awarded for the discovery of a new form of elemental carbon in which the atoms are arranged in a closed shell to form a ball. These three scientists worked together to make this discovery, and the resulting new form of carbon was known as a fullerene. Fullerenes are generated when carbon vapor, obtained by intense pulsed laser irradiation, condenses in the presence of an inert gas. Fullerenes of a variety of sizes are now known.
What is a pi bond?
A chemical bond in which two lobes of two orbitals on adjacent atoms overlap favorably.
What is a saturated solution?
A solution that contains the maximum amount of dissolvable solution, i.e. the addition of any more solution will not dissolve, and will remain in a separate phase.
What is message, and is it really so bad to consume?
Message stands for monosodium glutamate. It is a natural, but non-essential amino acid. It is used by food manufacturers as a flavor enhancer. and by itself has the taste of umami, the fifth taste sensation we mentioned in macroscopic properties, the world we see. There have been countless studies on its safety to eat, and the data overwhelmingly supports message as being safe to consume even in absurdly large quantities. But don't try to disprove those studies. Everything in moderation. Your mother was right about that.
How many different conformations can a protein adopt?
A lot. For a typical protein consisting of 100 amino acids, there are approximately 3,198 possible conformational states. This leads to something called Levinthal's paradox, which has to do with how a protein goes about sampling each of these possible states. If a protein just randomly went through each of 3,198 possible states, it would, on average, take longer than the age of the universe to get through all of them. Fortunately, proteins don't sample each of the possible conformations randomly. Instead, the gradient, or slope, of the energy along the folding pathway, along with the formation of local interactions between the amino acids, guides the protein toward states of lower energy. This allows it to avoid sampling most of the unimportant conformations as it folds toward its native state.
What determines which metals can be magnetized?
Chemists discuss magnetism in terms of three basic categories: diamagnetism, paramagnetism, and ferromagnetism. Diamagnetic materials have all of their electrons arranged in pairs, which, by definition, means that their spin magnetic moments must all be arranged in pairs and thus cancel each other out. For this reason, diamagnetic materials cannot be magnetic, and won't be influenced by magnetic fields. Paramagnetic materials have unpaired electrons, but in these materials the electrons spin magnetic. Moments cannot all be lined up in the same direction, which means that they cannot be strongly magnetic. Since they do have unpaired electrons, they can be influenced by applied magnetic fields, but not to the same extent as the third class, ferromagnetic materials. Ferromagnetic materials are the materials that can give rise to the magnets we're all familiar with. All of the materials that magnets can interact strongly with are ferromagnetic. In these materials, there are unpaired electrons whose magnetic spin can all be aligned in the same direction. Note that just because a material is ferromagnetic doesn't mean it must be a magnet, but rather just that it has the potential to be magnetized. Take a paper clip, for example. When you first pick it up, it's not a magnet, but you can turn it into a weak magnet by holding a magnet next to it for a short length of time. Some of the most common ferromagnetic substances are those made of iron, nickel, or cobalt.
Why did Richard Martin Willstetter, Germany, win the Nobel Prize for Chemistry.
For his researches on plant pigments, especially chlorophyll. Willstätter was a German organic chemist who studied a variety of pigments isolated from flowers and fruits. He was the first to show that chlorophyll was a mixture of two different compounds, known today as chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. These two molecules absorb slightly different wavelengths of light, so that the plant can capture more of the sun's energy.
How does one determine the oxidation state of an organometallic complex?
There are a few ways to approach this problem, and, of course, every chemist thinks the way they use is the most correct. But let's look at what is hopefully the simplest way to think about this. We're going to only talk about complexes with metal carbon bonds and no other types of ligands. If you're curious enough to want to know how nitroxide binds a transition metal, chances are you have an inorganic chemistry textbook at home anyway. Okay, let's look at tetra, methyl, zirconium, which has no net charge. In this counting technique, all of the electrons in the metal carbon bonds are placed on the carbon atoms. So we get 4 methyl anions and 1 zirconium ion. Since this complex has no net charge, the zirconium center must balance out the net 4 negative charges from the methyl groups. Zirconium must be in the +4 oxidation state. Easy, right? One more example, K3Fe, Cn, 6 or potassium hexacyanoferrate. We again move the electrons in the metal carbon bonds to the carbon groups, making 6 cyanide ions, Cn, an iron ion, and 3 potassium ions. We have 6 negative charges, 6 Cn, and 3 positive charges, 3 K and ions. So to balance out the charges, the iron center must be in the +3 oxidation state. Zrme4 for Me1 plus Zr4 plus K3 Fe, Cn, 6 3K1 plus 6 Cn1 plus Fe3 plus. It's important to remember that when we count electrons in this way, we're doing only that counting. Don't get the idea that all of these metal carbon bonds are the same, or that they're all ionic bonds. This is just for electron bookkeeping.
What pollutants are dangerous to the ozone layer?
The pollutants principally responsible for depletion of the ozone are volatile halogenated organic compounds. The most well-known among these are chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, and hydrochlorofluorocarbons. HCFCs, which used to be used in virtually all air conditioning, refrigeration, and cooling systems. Another is methyl bromide, which is used commercially as an agricultural fumigant.
What is an amalgam?
An alloy of mercury.
What is a lone pair?
A pair of valence electrons that are localized on a single atom, i.e., not involved in bonding.
Can cold weather really cause a cold?
This actually is not true. Colds are caused by a virus that must enter your body to cause cold symptoms. Contracting the cold virus really has nothing, directly, to do with cold weather. The only reason colds seem to be more prevalent during colder seasons is that people spend more time indoors, placing them in closer proximity to one another, which makes it easier for the virus to spread between people.
What is aromaticity?
Aromaticity is a special kind of resonance delocalization, one we've actually already seen. Delocalization of electrons always makes molecules more stable, compared to imaginary molecules where the electrons cannot spread out. If this delocalization takes place in a flat ring of n carbons, and the number of electrons involved is 4n plus 2, i.e., 2, 6, 10, 14, etc., then the system is called aromatic.
Who built the first MRI machine?
Dr. Raymond Domitian, who was formerly trained as a medical doctor, led construction of the first MRI. The first MRI capable of imaging a human was completed in 1977.
Why did Arne Wilhelm Karantiselius, Sweden, win the Nobel Prize for Chemistry?
For his research on electrophoresis and adsorption analysis, especially for his discoveries concerning the complex nature of the serum proteins.
How do your muscles work?
Muscles allow you to exercise and move heavy objects and are necessary for basic activities like breathing, pumping blood, and pretty much anything else you do. On a molecular level, muscles work based on the binding, movement, and rebinding of molecules called actin and myosin. This process involves the hydrolysis of ATP to generate energy. For your muscles to move, myosin first attaches to actin, forming a bridge. At this point, ADP and a phosphate group are attached to the myosin. The myosin bends. This is what actually controls movement, releasing the ADP and phosphate. Then a new ADP molecule binds again, and then the myosin releases the actin. The ADP is then hydrolyzed, putting the myosin back into its original position. At which point the cycle can begin again.
What are the main classes of biomolecules?
The four main classes of biomolecules are proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. Proteins are some of the most diverse biomolecules, and they can perform functions such as protecting the body from pathogens or acting as catalysts for chemical reactions. Carbohydrates can be a source of energy when your body needs it. Lipids include fat molecules and are used for energy storage, as well as to form the membranes that surround each cell. Nucleic acids are what make up our genetic material and store the information that determines a lot about who we are. We'll go into more details about each of these types of biomolecules in the upcoming pages.
Why did Arturi Ilmari Virtanen, Finland, win the Nobel Prize for Chemistry?
For his research and inventions in agricultural and nutrition chemistry. Especially for his fodder preservation method. Virtanen was quite an interesting chemist, and he was also a farmer. His fodder preservation method made use of hydrochloric and sulfuric acids to slow the processes that normally cause fodder to ferment. He also made several other achievements in the area of nutrition/agricultural chemistry, helping to better provide nutrition to animals raised on farms.
One might reasonably ask, why does this distinction even matter?
The reason it matters is that if we went to the moon, for example, the weight of an object would change, because the force of gravity on the moon is different from that on Earth. But the mass would be the same, since the object is made of the same amount of stuff. We just need to make sure everyone is talking about the same thing. We should point out that people commonly use scales to measure either weight or mass. But when we're using them to measure mass, the measurement relies on the fact that the scale has been calibrated based on the strength of gravity on the Earth. So it knows how to figure out the mass of an object from measuring its weight.
What is a cross-linked polymer?
When a bond is formed between two polymer chains, and technically not at the chain ends, the product is called a cross-linked polymer. Creating linkages between chains usually increases their viscosity. So more like molasses than olive oil, and creates elastic properties like those found in rubber bands. At higher levels of cross-linking, polymers can even become stiff or glassy.
What is radical?
A species containing unpaired electron density, typically involving an odd number of valence electrons.
Are the north and south poles of the Earth magnetic poles?
Without getting too technical on the physics here, it gets way more complicated with the whole planet. Versus a tiny piece of iron on your fridge, yes, the north and south poles are magnetic poles. But compasses point north. So what we call the North Pole is actually the South Magnetic Pole and vice versa.
How are polymers different than small molecules?
So many ways. Polymer chemistry and polymer physics are big areas of research both in the recent past and today. Because connecting a bunch of small molecules into one big one results in lots of interesting changes. To give you a metaphor, let's talk about pasta. Start with uncooked macaroni and uncooked spaghetti. If you try to move your hand through a bowl of uncooked macaroni, you won't have much trouble. But if you had spaghetti noodles all lined up and you tried to move your hand through them, in either direction, you'll run into problems. You either need to break the noodles, or you need to carefully thread the noodles through your fingers. Both of these actions require energy, enthalpy in the first case and entropy in the second. Now let's cook those noodles. Stick a fork in each of the bowls and spin it around. With macaroni, nothing happens, but the spaghetti starts to wind around your fork, gets tangled up, and so on. Macaroni, a collection of small molecules, noodles, is totally different than polymers. Spaghetti, which are also made up of flour and water, but are much longer. The raw and cooked spaghetti aren't just easy to imagine. They're great ways to think about polymers in different states, solids and liquids, glassy states, and polymer melts.
Why did Gerhard Ertl, Germany, win the Nobel Prize for Chemistry?
For his studies of chemical processes on solid surfaces. Surface chemistry is a topic of broad importance to many applied areas of chemistry. These include atmospheric chemistry, as some atmospherically relevant reactions take place at the surface of ice crystals. Semiconductors and solar energy capture, to name a few. Ertl was one of the founding fathers of modern surface science, and he played a role in developing many of the techniques used to study surfaces today. The study of well-characterized surfaces typically requires studies to be carried out under ultra-high vacuum conditions so as to avoid contamination of the surface. To be studied by any gas phase molecules that may tend to adsorb onto the surface.
What makes a material a good conductor of electricity?
Materials that are good conductors of electricity have many free electrons. Here we mean free in the sense that they are not bound strongly to a given atom or molecule. Metals are often good conductors of electricity. Whether or not a material has freely conducting electrons is related to the detailed electronic structure of the material, and a thorough description would be beyond the scope of this book. Basically, the more electrons that are free to move around in a material, the more easily it can carry current, and the higher its conductivity.
Why was gold chosen as a form of currency rather than any other element in the periodic table?
What a neat question. There are very basic attributes to money that made gold the obvious element. The element should be a solid at all temperatures it might encounter over the course of its lifetime. No one wants their money to boil away on a hot day. The element needs to be very stable. We wouldn't want our coins rusting, bursting into flame, or slowly giving off radiation. And finally, the element needs to be rare, but not too rare. After you remove elements that don't fit these parameters, we are left with rhodium, palladium, silver, platinum, and gold. Rhodium and platinum weren't discovered until the 19th century. So they weren't an option for ancient civilizations. The furnaces of the ancient world couldn't reach the temperature required to melt platinum. 3,200 degrees Fahrenheit, 1800 degrees Celsius, so it couldn't be made into coins. That leaves silver and gold. Gold has a lower melting point than silver and it doesn't tarnish in air like silver does, making it the clear winner for a currency element on our planet.
Are all polymer chains the same size?
No. Let's stick with the macaroni metaphor to understand this. Imagine you're stringing noodles together to make a macaroni necklace. You can put as many noodles on a single string as you want. If you have two strings, you can put an equal number of noodles on each string or make one longer than another. Again, the macaroni noodles are monomers, which form polymers when we string them together.
What is an empirical formula?
The relative ratios of elements in a substance.
How are glucose levels regulated?
In humans, the amount of glucose in the blood at any given time is regulated very carefully. If your blood glucose level is too high, your body releases a chemical called insulin into the bloodstream, signaling that it's time to convert some of the extra glucose floating around into glycogen. Similarly, if your blood glucose level gets too low, your body releases a chemical called glucagon into the bloodstream, telling your body to start breaking down that glycogen to release more glucose into the blood.
What is a hybrid orbital?
An orbital that is composed of multiple atomic orbitals, e.g., sp3 hybrid orbital.
Why did Dudley R. Hirschbach, United States, UNT Lee, United States, and John C. Polanyi, Canada/Hungary, win the Nobel Prize for Chemistry?
For their contributions concerning the dynamics of chemical elementary processes. Hirschbach was recognized for having developed the method of using crossed molecular beams to carry out detailed studies of chemical dynamics. Lee was initially working with Hirschbach, and independently further developed the method of using crossed molecular beams to study important reactions of relatively large molecules. Polanyi developed the method of using chemiluminescence in the infrared, where weak infrared emissions from recently formed molecules is measured to learn how energy is released during chemical reactions. Why did Donald J. Cram, United States, Jean-Marie Lane, France, and Charles J.
What is astrobiology?
Astrobiology is a branch of science concerned with looking for signs of life. Basically, anywhere other than on planet Earth. This isn't really the search for space aliens hanging out in close vicinity to our own planet, but rather astrobiology is focused on looking for any evidence for the current or prior existence of even the smallest, microbial, life forms elsewhere in space.
Do pesticides make food more dangerous?
Pesticides certainly don't help make food safer, but their adverse long-term effects are difficult to measure. Limiting exposure as much as possible is certainly a good idea.
What does selectivity mean for chemical reactions?
Selectivity can have several meanings for chemical reactions, but there are two main categories. Either a reaction will occur selectively with a particular chemical species or at a particular location in a molecule to avoid unwanted side reactions, or a reaction will produce a particular product selectively.
Why do shrimp change color when they're cooked?
Some, but not all shrimp, are grayish when they are raw, but turn pink once they're cooked. It makes sense to guess that this is because some chemical compound with a red color is being produced once you add heat. What's actually happening, though, is that the more intense pigments in the shrimp's shell are decomposing with heat, while the compound responsible for the red color is more stable. That red molecule is called astaxanthin. And it's not only found in shrimp shells but is also the reason that salmon meat is red. You'll probably be interested to know that there are a good number of chemistry experiments that you can perform right in your own home. While we can't teach every principle in this book with experiments that you can do with household items, we will do our best to illustrate some of the basic principles, mostly those relevant to basic chemistry lab work, with items you may already have in your kitchen.
What is a glycosidic linkage?
A glycosidic linkage is the chemical bond that bonds a carbohydrate to another carbohydrate molecule, or to another species. Glycosidic linkages are what hold together all of the individual glucose monomers that make up glycogen or starch. The figure below shows a glycosidic linkage. The enzymes that catalyze the breakage glycosidic linkages are called glycoside hydrolases. These are necessary to allow for glucose to be released from storage. The enzymes responsible for forming the linkages are called glycosyltransferases.
Why can some batteries be recharged and others cannot?
Batteries produce electricity from a chemical reaction. So to recharge a battery, we would have to be able to reverse the chemical reaction by applying an electric current. In truth, most batteries use chemical reactions that could be reversed. But there are efficiency considerations that come into play. Rechargeable batteries make use of reactions that can be reversed easily. Many times, without too much degradation of the battery materials. One-time use batteries typically use reactions that could only be reversed and reused a couple of times before they would not work very well anymore.
What is a molarity?
A measure of concentration defined as moles of solute per liter of solvent.
What is a nuclear chain reaction?
A nuclear chain reaction is a string of reactions that occurs when a given nuclear reaction causes, on average, at least one more nuclear reaction to take place. Such chain reactions are important for the generation of nuclear power and also for nuclear weapons. Uranium-235 is responsible for the chain reaction that generates power in nuclear reactors and in some bombs as well. Uranium-238 is the more common isotope, so it is typically necessary to first enrich the uranium to be used in the 235 isotope. When a neutron collides with uranium-235, it generates uranium-236, which then undergoes fission to release energy and further neutrons that can collide with other uranium-235 atoms, causing the chain reaction to continue.
What herbal medicines do people still use today?
Aspirin and quinine are probably the most famous herbal medicines that have made the transition to mainstream medicine. Many modern medicines were originally isolated from plants. However, but the commercial sources are now usually man-made. For example, Taxol, R. paclitaxel, was originally isolated from the Pacific yew tree. In 1967 this compound was found to be useful as a treatment for various types of cancer. For almost 30 years, most of the paclitaxel that was given to patients was obtained from the yew tree. Alternate supplies of this drug were developed in the 1990s. Moving this natural drug into the realm of modern synthetic medicines.
What is a glove box and what is its purpose?
A glove box is a method of carrying out chemical reactions under an inert atmosphere. It basically consists of a large box that has had the air removed and replaced with an inert gas, like pure nitrogen or argon. One side of the box is typically made of a clear, hard, transparent plastic, which has openings covered by large rubber gloves, into which a researcher can insert their arms. This allows a researcher to manipulate items inside the inert atmosphere of the glove box without letting any air inside. To move items in or out of the box, a purgeable antechamber is attached to one side of the box. While it is certainly not as easy to manipulate items inside a glove box as it is to manipulate items outside the box, a glove box provides one of the most straightforward approaches to carrying out chemistry in an air-free environment.
What is a fuel cell?
Device that converts chemical energy to electrical energy.
What's the difference between acetaminophen and ibuprofen?
While the structure of acetaminophen and ibuprofen are very different, the mode of action is similar. Both of these painkillers interfere with the COX family of enzymes we just talked about. Ibuprofen interacts more broadly with members of this family of enzymes, which ends up making it a good painkiller as well as a good anti-inflammatory medication. Acetaminophen binds primarily to one of the members of this family, COX-2, so it's basically just a painkiller.
What is astrochemistry?
Astrochemistry is chemistry in space. Astrochemists try to do what all chemists do: study molecules and the reactions of those molecules, except that these chemists are looking in outer space, where temperatures are extremely cold and concentrations are exceptionally dilute. These two properties of outer space combined mean that lots of very strange molecules can exist for a relatively long time.
How can I inflate a balloon using yeast?
Chemistry principles encountered in this experiment: biochemical/enzymatic reactions, gases, materials you'll need. Yeast, 5 to 10 grams powder yeast, a small plastic bottle, preferably about 16 ounces. Or smaller, 1 teaspoon of sugar, a balloon, warm water. The procedure: add enough water to a small plastic bottle to fill it up about 1 inch. The water needs to be warm for the yeast to do its job. Add about 5 to 10 grams of yeast, 1 small packet will do, to the bottle, and mix it around well. Yeast is made of fungal microorganisms that will become active when placed in the warm water. Add a teaspoon of sugar to the water. The sugar serves as the food for the yeast microorganisms. They are going to consume it and produce carbon dioxide gas as a byproduct. Wrap the balloon around the open end of the bottle. You may wish to use tape or a tight rubber band to prevent gas from escaping. Let the yeast do their job for about 20 minutes. And the yeast should soon produce enough carbon dioxide gas to start filling up the balloon. This is the same thing that happens when you use yeast to bake bread. The little holes you see in the bread are from the yeast releasing carbon dioxide as it rises. Try repeating the experiment using different amounts of water, sugar, and yeast, and observe the rate at which the balloon inflates. One hypothesis you might test is whether the concentration of sugar in the water affects the rate of carbon dioxide product. You might also try varying the amount of yeast you use. Pay attention to both the rate at which the balloon inflates, and the final volume of gas it reaches.
What are genes?
Genes are the basic unit of heredity. A gene is a sequence of nucleotides containing information on specific traits that shape the characteristics of an organism. Each person actually has 2 copies of each gene, one comes from each parent. There's not really a typical size for a gene. Since the number of base pairs in a gene can range from just a couple hundred base pairs to millions of base pairs. Most of the genetic information in each of our genes is actually the same from person to person. In fact, differences in less than 1% of the DNA in our genes accounts for all of the physical differences between people.
What is glue?
There are many different types of adhesives. But you're probably thinking of that white glue you had as a kid. This type of glue is known as a drying adhesive because it hardens by evaporation of a solvent. In the case of white glue, the solvent is water and the sticky stuff that gets left behind is polyvinyl acetate.
Why does asparagus make pee smell weird?
The compounds you smell in your pee after eating asparagus are most likely thioethers. Although the literature over the last 100 years on this subject includes some debate, no joke. That's a sulfur atom with 2 carbon substituents. Asparagus, for some reason, has high levels of sulfur-containing amino acids. Your body breaks these down into chemicals that smell like rotten eggs or other foul odors.
What is a standard state?
A standard state is a set of reference conditions with respect to which properties can be described/calculated under other conditions. For example, the properties at standard state conditions of a gas may be defined by its properties at 293.15 K and 1 bar of pressure. Knowledge of the properties of a gas under these standard conditions can be used to calculate the properties under other conditions.
Why did William S. Knowles, United States, and Ryojin Wayuri, Japan, win the Nobel Prize for Chemistry?
For their work on chirally catalyzed hydrogenation reactions and K. Barry Sharpless, United States, for his work on chirally catalyzed oxidation reactions. Half of this prize was awarded to Knowles and Noyori for their work with chiral catalysts that chirally catalyzed hydrogenation reactions, or reactions in which 2 hydrogen atoms are added. This work found applications in pharmaceutical production soon after its discovery. Sharpless was awarded the other half of this prize for developing chiral catalysts to carry out oxidation reactions, which represent another important class of reactions in organic synthesis.
What is the Curie point?
The temperature at or beyond which a ferromagnetic material becomes paramagnetic.
How do chemists study molecules so far away?
Special kinds of telescopes allow astrochemists to perform spectroscopy on the light or any type of electromagnetic radiation, not just visible light, coming from a star or other celestial body. Certain features of this radiation allow chemists to measure the quantities of different elements and the surface temperatures of objects like stars and comets.
What is the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation?
Equation for pH of a solution as a function of acid strength, pKa, pH equals pKa plus log 10, A-Ha.
Do all isotopes of an element decay at the same rate?
No, actually each isotope decays at a unique rate. The most radioactive isotopes are those isotopes which decay most quickly. There are some elements, especially the heaviest ones, that don't have any truly stable isotopes. And these can only be synthesized for fleeting amounts of time in laboratory settings.
In what professions is knowledge of biochemistry important?
Biochemistry is important for people interested in careers in human medicine, veterinary medicine, dentistry, pharmacy, and food science, as well as research in almost any physical or biological science and many subfields of engineering as well. While this list isn't all-inclusive, you can see that biochemistry is used by people working in many different areas.
What is an electronic wave function?
A mathematical description used to describe the electrons in a chemical system.
What is specific volume?
The volume occupied by a compound per unit mass.
What is the ozone layer and why is it so important?
Ozone has the chemical formula O3, and it is a gas that is naturally present in the Earth's atmosphere. Most of the ozone in the atmosphere exists as part of a layer that sits a few miles above the ground. This is the ozone layer, and it serves to protect the Earth from a significant fraction of the potentially harmful UV light from the sun. Depletion of the ozone layer means that more harmful UV light reaches the Earth's surface. Ozone is also a greenhouse gas, which means that it also plays an important role in controlling the Earth's climate.
What is the 18-electron rule?
Earlier we talked about the octet rule, which says that elements like carbon and oxygen are most stable when they have 8 valence electrons. For transition metals, as we've mentioned, the d orbitals start to become important. So 8 electrons just aren't enough anymore. Since there are 5 d orbitals, we need an additional 10 electrons to fill the valence shell. And 8 plus 10 equals 18, hence the 18-electron rule for transition metals.
What is an indicator?
A substance that undergoes an observable change in response to a chemical input, e.g., pH, redox, presence of a metal ion.
How does materials science help to keep your home warm in the winter?
By designing effective ways to insulate your home, of course. In total, 48% of the energy used annually in the US is spent on heating buildings during the colder seasons and keeping them cooled during the warmer seasons. Insulation materials help to maintain the temperature differences inside and outside of buildings. In addition to polystyrene and other types of insulation, materials to seal window panes and other potential leaks can significantly reduce the amount of energy we need to spend on heating and cooling.
What is Beer's law?
Beer's law tells us how the amount of electromagnetic radiation absorbed by a sample is related to the concentration of the absorbing species. Beer's law tells us that the absorbance is equal to the length of the sample, L, times the concentration, C, of the absorbing species in the sample, times the molar absorptivity coefficient. In this equation A is absorbance, which is defined as the negative of the logarithm of the ratio of the intensity of light passing through a sample to that incident on it. Basically, this gives us a measure of how much light a sample is absorbing and how much light is passing through it.
What is dilution?
Process that lowers the concentration of a substance.
What is the shape of a carbon-carbon double bond?
The geometry of the carbon atoms in double bonds is planar. This shape comes from the hybridization of the carbon atom, which is sp2, one p orbital is not involved in forming single bonds. To get a bonding interaction between these two remaining p orbitals, they have to overlap in space. So in a molecule like ethylene, C2H4, all of the hydrogen atoms are located in the same plane.
How can I make slime?
Chemistry principles encountered in this experiment. Hydrogen bonding synthesis polymer chemistry cross-linking materials. You'll need water Elmer's glue, about 4 ounces. Or 120 ml, borax powder, 4 to 5 tablespoons, bowl measuring cup small jar. Doesn't need to have a cover, spoon or stirring device. Food coloring, optional. The procedure. Pour about 4 ounces of white glue into the jar. The glue contains several components, including the polymers polyvinyl acetate and polyvinyl alcohol. See polymer chemistry. Polyvinyl acetate contains oxygen atoms that can serve as hydrogen bond acceptors. And polyvinyl alcohol contains hydroxyl groups that can serve as either hydrogen bond donors or acceptors. Add 1/2 cup, 4 ounces or 120 ml, of water, and stir it in until it mixes with the glue. Note that there is already some water in the glue, and we are just adding more. Optional, add food coloring to the mixture to give your slime some color. In the bowl, mix 1 cup, 8 ounces or 240 ml, of water with 4 or 5 tablespoons of the borax powder. Stir this well. Here we are preparing a solution of borax so that we can add it to the mixture of glue and water in a more uniform fashion. While mixing, slowly add the glue and water mixture to the solution of borax. As you mix, you should observe the slime forming. Pick it up with your hands and knead it until it seems fairly dry. There will still be extra water left behind in the bowl, that's nothing to worry about. The borax serves to cross-link the polymers by forming hydrogen bonds with the oxygen atoms of the polymers in the glue. These interactions can readily rearrange to form new hydrogen bond donor acceptor pairs with different oxygen and hydrogen atoms, which is what makes the glue so stretchy and readily deformed. When you are done with it, you can store the slime in a plastic bag in the refrigerator.
Is ceviche really cooked by lime juice?
The results of cooking with heat and with acid are similar, but of course they are not exactly the same. Both heat and acid serve to denature proteins in food, which is a technical way of saying that the molecules change shape. with access to any number of shapes that it couldn't exist in beforehand. The molecule finds new ways to react both with itself and with other protein molecules. These recently liberated proteins quickly form a solid network, which is why fish gets firmer and whiter when you add lime juice. And it's the same reason that egg whites turn opaque and get harder upon cooking.
What is nuclear fission?
Nuclear fission is essentially the opposite of nuclear fusion. Here, a single nucleus divides into two smaller nuclei. In the case of heavy atoms, this is often accompanied by the release of heat. For example, the radioactive decay of uranium-235 can be used to generate the heat used to drive turbines to generate electricity in nuclear power plants. The use of nuclear fission to harness energy for use by humans is typically considered the much more viable choice, as opposed to nuclear fusion.
What is the azeotrope?
A mixture that does not change composition during distillation.
What is polymorphism?
Polymorphism is the capacity for a compound to exist in different crystalline arrangements. This can arise due to different packing of the individual units of the crystal, or due to different conformations of the molecules making up the crystal.
What is an aliquot?
A sample taken from a larger amount of a material.
Why do you put iodine on cuts?
The iodine you buy at the drugstore is usually an ethanol solution of elemental iodine, I2. Iodine is a general disinfectant, meaning that it kills all sorts of pathogens, including spores, which are notoriously difficult to kill.
What is a flash point?
Temperature at which the vapor pressure of a liquid is high enough that the vapor can be ignited.
How can I make jello, that glows under a black light?
Chemistry principles encountered in this experiment: fluorescence gels cross-linking materials you'll need. Jello, or gelatin powder, 1 cup of tonic water, 1 cup of water, stovetop or microwave large bowl pot. For heating on stovetop, a black light source. See Physical and Theoretical Chemistry to review how black lights work. The procedure: heat 1 cup of water to a boil. Mix the jello, R, and the hot water into the bowl, and stir the powder in until it dissolves. The hot water helps the gelatin to dissolve and disperse evenly throughout the solution. Gelatin is a form of collagen, see Chemistry in the Kitchen, and when it cools, the jello, R, will reform cross-links between the collagen strands, which is what traps the water inside to create a gel. You'll recall that a gel is solid material that consists of a bonded network of long-strand molecules that contain significant amounts of molecules that would otherwise behave as a liquid trapped within the solid network. Add in 1 cup of tonic water, stir the solution well, and then place it in the refrigerator for about 4 hours. The tonic water contains a molecule called quinine that will fluoresce a bright blue color when excited with the appropriate wavelengths of light, which can be provided by the black light. Recall that fluorescence takes place when a molecule absorbs light at one wavelength, relaxes to release a fraction of that energy, and then emits a photon at a longer wavelength, lower energy, than that which was absorbed. Black lights provide light that is at slightly shorter wavelengths, higher energies, than light in the visible spectrum. So it can often excite molecules that will fluoresce in the visible region of the spectrum. When the jello, R, is finished hardening, take a look at it under the black light. It should glow blue. This is due to the fluorescence of the quinine from the tonic water. This blue glowing color comes from the fluorescence of the quinine molecules. So it will not be affected significantly by the flavor or color of jello, R, that you decided to use.
What is the density of a material?
Density is the mass, or weight, of a material divided by a unit of volume. Water, for example, has a density of 1.0 g/cm3, 1.0 gram per cubic centimeter.
How does blood clotting take place?
Platelets in the blood send a message to constrict blood vessels in the area surrounding a wound. Platelets gather to block the flow of blood coming out. At the same time, a chemical messenger called prothrombin activates an enzyme called thrombin, which then produces a species called fibrin. Fibrin forms threads to block the wound even better.
How did the first matter originate, and why was it all packed together in a very dense state?
Unfortunately, we cannot answer that one, and neither does the Big Bang Theory. Rather, the Big Bang Theory is only focused on explaining the evolution of the universe, from that initial state to what it is today and to what it will become in the future.
What elements are metals?
Metals are elements that easily conduct electricity. There are a number of sets of metals in the periodic table. Instead of just listing the metallic elements, let's take a look at those sets one at a time in the next few questions.
What's the difference between brown and white eggs?
Besides their color, the only difference is the color of the chicken that laid it. White feathered chickens lay white eggs, brown feathered chickens lay brown eggs. That's it. The inside of the eggs are identical in every way, assuming the chickens you're comparing were on identical diets.
How do nuclear power reactors work?
A nuclear power reactor works by generating heat from a controlled fission reaction, which then generates steam used to drive turbines to generate electricity. The fuel for the nuclear reactor is typically uranium-235 or plutonium-239.